Hi, I'm Anthony Slaughter, the leader of Wales Green Party, and I'm really pleased, delighted to have been asked to chair this very timely and important discussion. And to be honest, I'm looking forward to asking the questions for a change and having to answer them. It's great to see so many people here. It's obviously a topic that a lot of people are thinking about, so I'm looking forward to a very, very good discussion. Just to remind everyone, we have got the chat open, so do share your thoughts, comments, and we'll try and pick up on questions given time constraints. What we'd really like you to do in the chat, though, is if you could tell us how UBI would be a game changer for you personally. That would be great if we could collect some of those thoughts. And on that subject, if you're on social media, if you're live tweeting or anything else, the hashtag we'd like to use this evening is hashtag UBI Game Changer. I'll start. We've got an excellent panel, so I'll start by some brief introductions, and then we'll get down to the discussion. I'll introduce people in the way they're appearing on my screen, so it's not to indicate any favoritism or order. So first up, I can see Jonathan Rhys-Williams, who is co-founder of UBI Lab Wales and co-founder of UBI Lab Cardiff. Good, Jonathan. Next is Molly Scott-Cato, a former Green Party MEP, and also a distinguished professor of economics, as a certain UKIP member of the European Parliament once had to be reminded. Next to Molly, I've got Amelia Womack, the deputy leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, who's also co-chair of People's Assembly and a co-founder of Another Europe is Possible. And last but by no means least, and it'll probably shift around during the evening, is Ciaran Sturge, a co-founder of UBI Lab Swansea and also a committee member of UBI Lab Cymru. So it's really great to have this meeting, sort of combination of Green Party and the UBI Lab, because this is a subject that is of great importance to both organisations. I think to start the discussion, it's fair to say we can't ignore the last 12 months. It's been, COVID has exposed so much. The structural flaws in our system, our society, the obscene levels of inequality have become so apparent. And it's obvious that the way we were doing things weren't working. So lots of people are looking for new ideas, and we hear lots of talk and some glib words from some politicians about building back better and not going back to normal. And I think that's what this discussion tonight is about. I mean, particularly here in Wales, the pandemic has exposed. We've already got, pre-pandemic, had 1 in 5 people in Wales living in poverty. We've got a society that punishes its most vulnerable with a cruel and unfair benefit system. So we have to find better ways of doing this. And so universal basic income, an idea that's been around for a long time, some of us have been talking for some years, but has become much bigger public awareness of it in the last year. But I think a good way to start, because we talk about UBI, and some of us, as I said, have been talking about it for a while and have some good ideas about it. Other people have come to it more recently and like what they see. And to coin a phrase from another movement, there are probably some people in the room who are a bit UBI curious. So I wonder if we could start with you, Jonathan, with sort of an overview of what is UBI? What does UBI actually mean?
Yes, so thank you very much, Anthony, for the introductions, and thank you very much to Lauren as well for setting this up this evening. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you all this evening. So I suppose, and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, because of course this has been Green Party policy for quite some time. So you guys are of course ahead of the game in terms of UBI. Just to give you, I suppose, a little bit of history. So a universal basic income, the concept has been around for, well, since democracy really. So many people will tell you that the idea first started with Thomas More and his book Utopia, but in fact you'll find that it first started with the Greeks. So the Greeks used to pay people an income in order to participate in the polis of the day. So it's actually it started with the Greeks, but of course it did find fame with Thomas More and his book Utopia, where he of course discusses universal basic income. And of course in his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, he actually discusses how the earth and common property of man should be shared between everyone, and it's really found fame there. But I suppose for me, a UBI now is the future. It is something that I feel is inevitable, and I think that, of course, like I said, you guys are ahead of the game, but there's many politicians now that really need to get on the boat rather than miss it. and I think it is inevitable. But a UBI, I suppose, in its simplest form, is a fixed, regular, and unconditional payment made to every citizen, regardless of their income, wealth, or employment status. And a UBI is a foundation upon which we can all build from. So I think that COVID, of course, has been the great revealer in that it showed that our welfare system is certainly not fit for purpose. And there are people, of course, that have had to sign on to universal credit, for example, that never thought that they would have to do that. So in that sense, it has been the great revealer. But a UBI is a policy for me that ensures that destitution is a thing of the past. It ensures that children no longer go to school hungry. It ensures that you're no longer held over a barrel by bad employers. It ensures that you're no longer making decisions as to whether or not you feed yourself or you put money in the electricity meter. It means that people can take that leap of faith in terms of setting up a business or going on to further education. So it's multifaceted, a UBI. It has a number of benefits, and I'm not professing at all that it's a silver bullet to poverty or inequality. There are a number of things that we need to do in order to address these things, but it's a foundation, like I said, upon which we can all build from. I think that it's a 21st century solution to 21st century problems. Our welfare system was set up in the 20th century, and it's still a 20th century welfare system. It's not one that is fit, as I mentioned, for purpose today. It's, you know, we have 0-hour contracts, for example, or a number of people on 0-hour contracts. We have the gig economy that has boomed in the last 10 years, and it would provide people with that security, and the people who are on those 0-hour contracts to no longer suffer the anxiety of whether or not they have enough hours the next week to feed their families. It like I said, it ensures that everybody has that level of security. It means that 3 million people are no longer excluded from benefits. It means that people are no longer falling through the gaps because it captures everyone. So it's a policy for the 21st century. It's a policy that addresses things like climate change or automation, the rise of the gig economy, increasing levels of poverty. I mean, there's a number of reports that say that, you know, inequality is at Victorian levels now, and I think that a UBI could go a long way in addressing that. And I think the take-home message really is that in the midst of the last national crisis that this country faced, being the Second World War, the NHS was born, a universal healthcare that provides healthcare for everyone. And at the end of this national crisis, COVID now that we face, I think that a UBI could be our generation's NHS. I think that's what I would have to say in terms of what a UBI is.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was quite comprehensive. A really good overview, really. And I think you used the word security, and I think the word dignity comes into it as well. It's about giving people the freedom to live their lives. I mean, we've got several questions, and I'm going to share them out amongst the panelists. But do any of the other three panelists want to add anything to Jonathan's? And I think he really covered that, though. Okay, well, you mentioned COVID, and we talked about, I think for me, one of the big lessons at the start of the pandemic and the lockdown, after years of having been told that running a national economy was the same as running a household economy, and the inevitable need for austerity, we found a government panicked, and it suddenly found the magic money tree. It realised it had to throw money at things to keep the economy going, to keep people alive. So we've had a really mixture, and some good, some possibly bad. We've had the different furlough schemes, self-isolation grants. There's been some grants for self-employed, or some self-employed. I mean, Jonathan used the word excluded. That's a very important campaign. So I'd like to ask you, Molly, I mean, what do you think of what the government's done, of the government's approach? Has it worked? Did it do what was needed?
I'm just going to start by arguing a bit of history with Jonathan, because whenever people say something was great about the Greeks, I always have to remind them that it was a slave society. And I'm sure it was fantastic getting a citizen's income if you were a citizen, but obviously the society ran on a lot of people not being citizens. And the key principle of the citizen's income is universal. So everybody who's a citizen gets it. And we might maybe later come to talk about who should be a citizen and how we should define that, but we certainly wouldn't define it in the way the Greeks did. And if I'm going to go back through history thinking about the citizen's income, I think the really inspiring moment when it broke through was actually after the Civil War, when the people who'd fought off the king kind of all sat down in Putney and said, you know, what do we want the world to look like? And of course they went for universal suffrage. Some of them even said women might vote. And yeah, they really made the radical demands on which US democracy, I think, was later based. But one of the things they did argue for very strongly was that they should have an income based on the Commonwealth. That was the principle, that everybody should have a fair share of the Commonwealth. And to me, that's still at the heart of the principle of universal basic income. And of course, then in subsequent centuries, that what ordinary people did have access to, which was land to graze their animals, was then enclosed and taken away from them. So in a sense, over the centuries when capitalism first came in, people lost power and they lost the ability to meet their own needs, and they became wage slaves. And UBI is now something that would prevent, you know, would remove the need for people to be wage slaves, because it was underpin their basic security. Anyway, enough of history. I'm not supposed to talk about that. I'm supposed to talk about the present and the situation with COVID. And it was an extraordinary thing, wasn't it, when suddenly the Chancellor said, oh, I tell you what, I'm going to underpin all your incomes. And we were like, yeah, he's been convinced. He's going to do basic income. But no, he brought in this furlough scheme. And the furlough scheme was quite an interesting scheme, because up to a certain threshold, I think it was about £2,500 a month, it actually reinforced the inequality of the existing wage structure. And so, you know, actually people who were in insecure employment, as Jonathan pointed out, in the gig economy, often were not covered by the furlough scheme, whereas those who were earning more, the people who were paying taxes and earning less, were funding them to receive more. And that again contradicts the principle of a citizen's income, which is that everybody should have an equal share and a fair share, although slightly more for older people, retired people who are not expected to be working, and less for children. But nonetheless, that principle is very important. And furlough cut across that. And of course, also it fell into the trap that Tories always fall into, which is that they think you're a lazy sod, basically, and you won't work. And so they have to sort of connect any payment they give you to the fact that you will continue to be in employment. And the other thing is that they only reward work. So you don't get money because you're a citizen, you get money because you're a worker. And so if you find it hard to define your work, or to explain exactly the basis how you work, or provide the accounts for how much you work, then you fall through the net. And that's why furlough has let, I think it's about 3 million self-employed people down incredibly badly. And in fact, they have been reduced to destitution through this system, whereas a citizen's income would have been equal and it would have supported everybody. And as Anthony said, everybody could see that that was the logical answer to this problem. And in fact, other countries introduced it. So in the US, I think Trump threw a lot of money at people because he wanted to win the election. And now Biden's the president, I think he's going to give everybody $1,400 a month, is it? Yeah, I think it's $1,400 a month. And in Australia also, people are sort of funneling money out in terms of what they call helicopter money, just giving money directly to people because it's needed to stimulate the economy. So I think COVID has really shifted the argument about where governments can find money, for one thing, but also what responsibility they have for supporting us. And it really strengthened the case for a citizen's income. And just finally, to say that the thing that was done worst of all, well, there's so many mistakes in how they handled this pandemic, and we could make a huge tragic litany of them. But for me, the most fundamental is that what you want to do to stop the disease spreading is to make sure that people who are infected go into quarantine. That is the overwhelmingly important message and the thing you need to support. And because people on low incomes, were not supported, and self-employed people were not supported, actually about 80% of people who are infected just carry on as normal. And so we've had absolutely no ability to contain COVID because the government has not been prepared to give the necessary support grants, and it's been very difficult to claim them. Whereas if we'd had citizens' income, people would have been supported to stay at home, and our communities would have been safer. And to be honest, we have seen, as we know, well over 100,000 deaths now, and so many of those deaths could have been prevented if the government had introduced citizens' income at an early stage. So there are many arguments that I'm sure do go back to the Greeks, or perhaps even further, but there are very recent arguments that come in also to support them. And so I think there's never been such a good time to argue for this policy, and it would, as Jonathan said, be completely transformative in terms of our relationship to the labour market, in terms of our ability to fulfil our human potential, and also just in terms of taking away that fear of insecurity, which we all live with in a capitalist economy, and which as human beings we shouldn't have to endure.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks for the history lesson as well. It's much appreciated.
Couldn't resist, apologies.
I don't know if anyone else wants to come back on that. There's a couple of questions in the chat that slightly relate to it. Bob Gillespie's asked, would UBI be paid only to citizens? So what happens to migrant population? Should we not have an all of us first view of UBI, is what Bob asks. And David Griffin is asking, does UBI go along with a minimum wage? Or do we think that pay automatically rises when people did have to work? Anyone wants to come back on that from the panel speakers? Or Molly?
There's always an argument between whether you should have a minimum wage or a citizen's income, and the answer is that you should have both.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't need the minimum wage as much, because if people were supported with a citizen's income, they wouldn't have to accept really poor quality or low paid work. But when they do go into work, then they should receive a decent rate of pay per hour. So we need both those policies. And the question of who is a citizen is a separate but very important question. So as Greens, we define a citizen in terms of where you live and where you contribute. So we don't have that narrow sort of definition, or you were born somewhere else, or you've only lived here this long, so you're not a citizen. So when we say a citizen's income, we think everybody who's living in and contributing to our communities and bringing all the joy and happiness, whatever, that we share as a community, all those people are citizens, and they would all get the citizen's income.
Thanks. Sorry, Amelia?
Also like to add on the minimum wage point that also things like 0-hour contracts should still be stopped, because just because there is financial support through a universal basic income, that shouldn't mean that people's rights such as holiday and maternity pay and sick leave should be eroded as well. So I think it's really important that we don't allow any new kind of universal basic income to enable exploitative mechanisms.
No, I think that's a very important point. Jonathan, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, with regards to, I completely concur with what Molly said. You know, I think it's almost a moot point, really, isn't it? You know, whether it's either or, it should be both. You know, you should have a minimum wage, absolutely, in addition to a citizen universal basic income. And I think I always find this interesting, that why the trade unions don't actually back this, because to my mind, you know, a universal basic income empowers people, you know, so it ensures that you're no longer held over a barrel by bad employers. So I don't quite understand why, for example, trade unions don't back this. I think that it's the perfect opportunity. It almost, you know, it enforces that collective bargaining, doesn't it? Because, you know, people no longer have to put up with bad employers. And I sort of don't want to digress too much here, but it's the same with universal basic services as well. I don't think it's an either or. I think we should be fighting for both.
Can I just chip in quickly on trade unions? Because the way I see that is that essentially there's a 19th century pattern to our economic life, which is, you know, you're either a boss or you're an employee. And if you're a boss, the Tories look after you. And if you're an employee, then Labour looks after you. And the clue's in the name, isn't it? It's all about Labour. Whereas as Greens, we don't see you as a unit of Labour. We think that people are wonderful, beautiful human beings, because we're all hippies, really, aren't we? Everybody knows that. And so we think that's why we support the citizens' income. But if you're a trade, I mean, I'm a trade unionist. I'm a huge supporter of trade unions. And I do that because I think people should be empowered at work. But I don't think that's the main way that you gain power through a trade union. I think that it's through political engagement, and that will be supported by a citizen's income. But I don't think it's an irreconcilable position. And we should lobby very hard for the trade unions to support this, because obviously that's going to be crucial in gaining widespread support and getting the policy introduced. Anyway, if there's anybody here who is from a trade union that does or doesn't support, it'd be very interesting to hear from them in a bit. Sorry, Anthony, I'm shutting up.
No, that's a good point. But I've just had a message from head office saying, stop saying hippie, Molly, please. Earlier on in the chat, I did notice Ken Barker, who's a Cardiff Green Party member and involved with trade unions, I can't see what he said now, but he did raise the issue of, has there been any contact with trade unions? So
yes, I can say that there has been. So we're working with the trade unions at the moment, the Wales Lab. So yeah, watch this space.
Excellent, good to hear. So we had a really good overview of what UBI is, and Molly's described a situation that we all know isn't working and isn't doing what it should do. So moving now to Ciaran from UBI Lab, if you could say why is UBI the answer?
Thank you, Anthony. Well, if we use Wales as a reference point, we have huge levels of poverty here in Wales, and in its simplest form, poverty is a lack of cash, and a UBI would, again, in the simplest form, put cash back in the hands of the poorest and therefore stimulate the economy. So, why is it a sensible way forward? Well, it will provide a safety net, in what is a rapidly changing Wales. We've been affected by the economic shock of COVID. We've got the present and future displacement of workers, potentially with automated technologies and automation. And our view is that UBI would help reverse, as we've discussed, we touched on the punitive welfare conditionality. It has emancipatory effects, UBI. It gives people the freedom to decide what they want to do. It gives people the freedom to decide if they want to go back into education, or take that leap of faith into creating their own business. And what we know as well is from previous pilots that have been carried out, that it also improves physical and mental well-being, and therefore reducing things like strains on our NHS, which is, as we all know, struggling at the moment. And looking forward in the future, it would promote artistic contributions to the Welsh society. And one of the key points, I think, with looking forward and why a UBI is a sensible way forward, it takes account of paying for what we consider at the moment unpaid work. It takes account of key social contributions such as unpaid care work, for example, which should be recognised. And it strengthens the power of workers to decide not to take the jobs, as we've touched on, with 0-hour contracts that are low paid or insecure. It's looking at legislation that's been introduced in Wales recently as well, with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's demonstrated that we've made legislative commitments to social progress. Looking forward, in order to achieve that progress, I think we'll need radical ideas, new ideas like a UBI to help us achieve that. Now, looking forward, we have what looks like cross-party agreement from the Green Party. There's Welsh Labour, there's Welsh Liberal Democrats, there's Plaid, all expressing public support now for a UBI. I think looking forward, the time is coming. Motions now, as we've discussed, have been passed in the Senedd and in Swansea and Cardiff. We have barriers that we need to overcome. With current devolution settlement, for example, it's placing constraints on the feasibility of a basic income. But I think why is it a sensible way forward? We as a result of COVID, which has been the great revealer, know that there's massive deprivation in this country. We know that there's been gaps. We know there are 3.1 million falling through those gaps. UBI would be a way of supporting those and making sure that no one falls through those gaps again, and making sure that the deprivation in this country, well, there's a levelling up, I suppose, of that.
Yeah, I'm glad you focused on Wales quite heavily there, which I'm quite glad you didn't. There was a question in the chat about what's Labour's position. You did touch on it, and as you said, in Wales, we've had former First Minister Carwyn Jones is fully on board in support of UBI.
Yeah.
Sophie Howe, Future Generations Commissioner, is fully on board. So we're in quite a unique position in Wales, I think, compared to possibly England, in that there is growing, and as you say, I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, but there is growing cross-party support for this idea. And we had that situation with the vote in the Senate, which came up against the fact that it didn't matter what Welsh Labour implied, can we thought, about UBI, because they can't do it. So there's an interesting overlap with the independence question, isn't there? Or even just increased devolution. So do we need to be arguing for devolution of welfare so that Wales could move forward? Or do we admit the limitations in Wales, even though there's so much public support for it, and push at a UK level? I'm interested if you have any thoughts on that, or anyone else, any other speakers. Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, it's unavoidable, isn't it? The question about whether or not it's easier to implement a universal basic income if you're in an independent nation, or whether or not it's easier for us to do it as part of the UK. And I think the point really is that you absolutely have to argue, and I think that there are a number of arguments that run parallel alongside a universal basic income. One, that we need to be arguing for the devolution of social security in Wales in order to implement a universal basic income, if it's not the independence route we take. And also there's that argument as well, another argument that runs parallel with it, in terms of how we tax people in this country, which is I won't digress into that too much, but it's certainly it's an argument or a conversation that has to be had. I mean, for example, if we were to, we're advocating that we have a pilot in Wales, for example, and there's a working paper that we're working on at the moment in terms of outlining what that would look like, and we've worked with the Future Generations Commissioner on their paper as well, and it's something that it's a conversation that we're going to have. I mean, we're alert to the idea that in order to have a pilot in Wales, for example, you're going to have to get Westminster sign off for it. The Welsh government are not going to pay for it, so there's going to have to be funding from there. So I think the point is that these arguments, they have to run parallel with each other. You can't just be advocating for a universal basic income. You have to be advocating for the devolution of powers in Wales. You have to be arguing about increasing taxes and that type of thing as well, in order to fund these projects. So yes, it's again, like I said at the top, really it's multifaceted, universal basic income and the arguments for it.
That ties in, for us, it ties in quite perfectly with Green Party policy anyway, because we believe in devolution of power to the lowest possible level. So absolutely, the Welsh Government should have the right to run a pilot, or even to introduce it. I don't know if any of the other speakers wanted to come in on any of those points. Molly?
I want to leave space for Amelia, so I'll just say briefly, I think freedom is at the heart of it. I didn't say that. I think it was Ciaran who said that, but to me it's all about freedom. We're not free when we're having to go to work to survive, and UBI would make us free. And of course, to me, that links very much with independence, and I can imagine freedom in Wales much more easily than I can imagine freedom in England, I have to say. But it's very important when you say other people are supporting UBI that they're actually supporting UBI, because quite often you feel you've won some of the arguments of principle, but then they'll slip in some conditionality, like you may have to make your children go to school, or you have to be working. So if it's not unconditional, it's not UBI. And I think we have to stick to those principles, because otherwise we won't have freedom. And just in terms of taxation and so on, as you said, Anthony, we're very much for devolving powers over taxation to the local level, because essentially what happens at the moment is you pay income tax and it all goes to London, and then you have to go with your begging bowl, to ask for some back. Why is that? We're all paying income tax. If we paid it locally, they would have to then apply to us to get the money to pay for Trident or whatever else it was. And just to say as well that the way I see us funding this is particularly through a carbon tax, so that energy intensive activities and products became more expensive, but the money that you gained through the carbon tax you then sent back through universal basic income, and also of course a wealth tax, because part of the purpose of this is to address age-old inequalities, and the wealth tax is, to my mind, the most efficient way of doing that.
Absolutely. I think, the key word is unconditional, and that leads quite nicely on to the next question I've been given. And it's something that we've all come across before. It's what about rich people? Why do they get it? And I remember I did a sixth form hustings several years ago, and several of the people were outraged that I argued that George Osborne should get it as much as their parents should get it. So I don't know, Amelia, if you want to defend the rich and say why they should get universal basic income. Thanks.
I think it's really powerful that we are talking about a universal basic income, because when we look at the problems with our current system, much of the issues surrounding it are issues of access, of stigma, of creating a class of people within our society of who should be allowed things and who should not. And I think that there is so much so much tied up in our levels of inequality that's about how we perceive people. And by having a universal basic income, it means we are all one in the same in receiving it. It doesn't mean that rich people are going to benefit specifically as a result. As Molly said, this will be tied into other taxations and other ways that will mean that effectively the top 1% of earners won't be better off as a result of having a universal basic income. The people who will benefit, though, are the people who are the poorest, and even the people on middle incomes, the people who are at risk of slipping through the net, or the people who want to pursue a career in an area such as in the arts or other areas that are vastly inaccessible for people unless you have a lot of money to hand. It will also benefit, one thing that's not been talked about as well is the benefits that a universal basic income can bring to women. I think that as someone who's experienced domestic violence, then the power of having money in your pocket to be able to flee an abusive situation and know that you can stand on your own 2 feet is a really powerful place to put people in. So the fact that it's universal basic income is that even the rich can get it is because it's a basic principle of making sure that we are having equality at the heart of this. It will readdress many inequalities that we've had throughout history as well. But even the kind of principle, there's also a different aspect that is beneficial as well. And that's just that it's the simplest form of getting it out there, of just making sure that everybody receives this money in their bank accounts without there being the bureaucracy, without there being the red tape, without there being, if you earn £1 more, then you will lose money from your universal basic income. It will balance. I think that the argument about the rich misses out all of those other points that we've talked about taxation, but also the power it brings people. I think that the stigma we have around people needing support in our communities, people wanting to use financial support. It's not a charity. Needing money from the government, it's not a charity case. It's a failure of a system that has meant that people need to have that support. And if people had it fundamentally as a right, we can work to try and readdress some of those imbalances.
Thanks, Amelia. I think that is absolutely right about universalness of it all. And yeah, I'm glad you touched on domestic violence. I was going to bring that up because you've highlighted how it'll be such an asset for vulnerable people and people at risk. But I think the key thing as well, something you touched on, and what's come out of the sort of Rishi Sunak's attempts to do the right thing, is just how complicated it all got, and which inevitably led to people being left behind or left out, and the 3 million excluded. So it's just coming from every speaker. The more you hear, it's just, if I was hearing this for the first time, I'd be sold completely. I don't know, anyone else has got any thoughts on the rich or the undeserving? Molly? And then Jonathan?
Right, okay, I can unmute myself now. Yeah, I think this principle of universality is so important, and obviously there's a long history of arguing about that in social welfare academic circles. But to me, what it boils down to is that if everybody gains from a system, then everybody's committed to that system. And that's the principle that set up the NHS, right? Jonathan very rightly said that we set up that after a period of great crisis. And it was because there was a sense of mutuality and the need to share and for everybody to benefit and everybody to be equal. And that principle is really important. And we don't have that principle in our welfare system. And we have people making these really gross distinctions between strivers and skivers, as if it's not possible for anybody to end up needing support. And in fact, if we live long enough, we're lucky to live long enough and get a pension. All of us are going to end up on welfare, right? So it's an artificial kind of Tory-driven ideology that says if you claim anything, you're a skiver. And UBI just destroys that argument. It says, no, I deserve my share of the commonwealth of this country. You know, Lord Fauntleroy, he comes and acquires 55,000 acres just through being born. You know, I want my share. Anyway, that's how I see it. But also, I think what's really important to say is that when we're funding this, if you currently work, then you receive a tax-free allowance. And for people who worked, the tax-free allowance will be netted off against this universal basic income. So that would help to fund it. And also, as I already said, you know, we would have a much more progressive taxation system, not just because we want to fund things like, you know, electrified transport and home retrofit and so on, but also because we just think taxation should be used to reduce inequality, because as the Spirit Level showed a few years ago, and as we all know from our experience, in more equal societies, everybody is happier and healthier. And that is also a key principle here.
Thanks, Amelia. Jonathan, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just think that, you know, on the point of how we fund this, I think, you know, it's clearly an important point that we all should address, and particularly when we're talking about wealth taxes. I mean, something that I found very interesting was that so the London School of Economics published a report that said if you taxed everyone with assets over £500,000, and that doesn't include your first home, if you taxed everyone 5% with assets of over £500,000 in the UK, you would raise £262 billion just in one hit. Now, there's also a report by Carl Wildekis that says that you could fund a universal basic income in the UK for £67 billion. So if you take those two things together, then if you actually did that wealth tax every 4 years, then you could pay for the universal basic income without increasing any other taxes. You just simply do that one-off tax every 4 years. But I think we should be thinking outside the box in terms of how we fund this as well. And also, I mean, something that the lab has been discussing at length really of late is that something in terms of a sovereign wealth fund for Wales. So, for example, we had the Tidal Lagoon project in Swansea, which was given the go-ahead, or at least given the green light in terms of it would work. So, you know, why are we not thinking about building things like that, the Swansea Tidal Lagoon, and putting the profits from that Tidal Lagoon in a sovereign wealth fund, and then paying everyone a universal basic income out of that sovereign wealth fund? It would be a green version of what Alaska has in terms of their sovereign wealth fund, because of course they extract the oil and the profits from the oil go into a sovereign wealth fund, and everyone in the state of Alaska is paid money. So it's a win-win, you know, in terms of it's a green sovereign wealth fund. So, and I think in Wales we only use a third of the electricity we produce. You know, I think Ciaran alluded to it earlier on that you know, we have we're set up quite well in terms of wind and tidal energy. So there's these types of things that we should be looking at as well. I think there's alternative ways in which would pay for it. But I completely agree with everyone, and I'm sure everyone on the call also agrees that we do need better progressive taxation. I mean, you know, if we reversed corporation tax as well, you would raise a lot of money as well, to the levels that it was in 2010. So yeah, there's a number of ways in which you could pay for this, and you know, hence why you know, you're not restricted to one way in which you can pay for it.
Right. I'm glad you both touched on funding, because quite a few people have raised that in the chat, and it's picked up. It's always the first question is how are you going to fund it? And I like what you're saying about the, should we call it a green sovereign fund? Makes me wonder who's leaked our Wales Green Party Senedd manifesto. You're talking about that.
I thought that was my idea, Anthony.
Okay, maybe. Great minds thinking alike.
There we go.
The other thing that comes up with funding as well is just the sheer cost of the current benefit system, the sheer waste involved. And that's the other thing that we need to argue with UBI, that it takes out that. And an argument I always go back to, and I like your hashtag, our generation's NHS. You know, we paid for the NHS because we had to. It was the right thing to do. We came out of the Second World War and we built council housing and we built the NHS because it needed to be done. And I think that's always my fallback argument about funding. You pay for the right things to be done because they need to be done. But in terms of practicality, I'm just trying to go through the chat. Someone's asking, this is a very practical question, it does come up quite often. What happens to people's rent in terms of, say, housing benefit or mortgage payments? So we introduced universal basic income. What's the transition with people who are reliant on the housing benefit, for instance? What are people's thoughts? Any thoughts on that?
I can go with
Ciaran?
I think at first instance, we wouldn't take away the housing element or the disability element. The idea is that it's not meant to make people poorer. It'll take away the standard element, and the standard element is where you have your the punitive side. The physically going on and signing on for the dole is what we want to come away with. We want to have the emancipatory effects of it. In terms of taking away other benefits, what we currently see is keeping them as they are. So the housing benefit, the disability benefit would remain. UBI would essentially top them up, and you take away the standard element then of universal credit. That's what we're considering at the moment, with a possible pilot.
Can I chip in on that one, Anthony?
Sure.
I think what we're doing here is establishing the principle, and the principle we're establishing is that it should be based on need. And that's why if you need more, as I explained with pensioners, then you would receive a higher rate. And that also applies to people with disabilities. If they need more because they have greater needs, or if they need more because they're not so able to work to top up the benefit. And on the question of housing benefit, I mean, the proposal at the moment is that that would continue on. But I think there is a question about whether housing should be something that's, but in my mind anyway, this is not Green Party policy now, but in my mind there's a question around whether something as fundamental as housing should be left to the vagaries of the market, or whether we should make an argument, and I'm sure this is an argument that would play much better in Wales than it would in Gloucestershire where I live, but whether we should just see socially provided housing as the norm rather than the exception. But either way, we accept that the universal basic income is not sufficient to pay your housing costs. So either you continue to get housing benefit, or we provide social housing. And in my view, the latter might work better in the long term.
Thanks, Molly. I'm struggling to see any more questions. Has any of the speakers got anything they'd like to add to what's been said so far? Or if anyone wants to put a question in the chat? Could I ask then, well, I'll ask a question, this is asking UBI Lab. What is the state of your campaign in Wales at the moment? I notice new groups popping up all over the place, so just quite interesting to hear how it's going.
Yeah, it's going very well, Anthony. So we have the Wales Lab that sort of oversees all of the borough labs. We have, in terms of borough labs then, RCT, Swansea, Cardiff, Gwynedd, and Caerphilly is our latest lab. And Helena, if you're on the call, hello, welcome. So the aim is really to sort of knock down all of these councils in Wales. So we want to set up labs all across Wales, as many as we possibly can. Try and engage with the public. I mean, I think that the Overton window in terms of a universal basic income has certainly moved over the last 12 months. There's no doubt about that. I think that it's now mainstream policy. However, I mean, the Times Radio, Times Radio ran a poll recently that showed that only 8% of people actually know what a universal basic income is. So I think that the work for the lab in terms of what we do in 2021 is to get a UBI into people's consciousness. We want the majority of people to know what a UBI is. So we've come a very long way in the last 12 months, but there's a hell of a long way to go. And with setting up these borough labs, and when we're released back into the wild, when COVID has gone, then we can start engaging a little bit more with people on a community level. So that's what we're doing. It's building steadily and slowly, and creating that political pressure in order for the Welsh government to have no option but to to implement a pilot at the very least.
Coming on what Jonathan was saying, I think, you know, we understand that at the moment each motion that passes in a geographical lab is symbolic. You know, we've touched on the fact that we don't have the devolved power to implement a universal basic income at present in Wales. So I think in terms of what we're trying to do in the lab at the moment, as Jonathan touched on, is tap into people's consciousness, make this more of a mainstream idea. And, you know, the way we view that is if we can sort of knock down almost a domino effect with each local authority in Wales passing a motion. Yes, at the moment it's symbolic, but, you know, if there's enough pressure, then maybe Westminster, Boris Johnson's a populist. You know, there's an outside chance he might run with the direction of the crowd if he hasn't resigned by that point.
Yeah, I think it's been really impressive seeing the different boroughs and the motions being passed. Sort of to go back to something Molly was talking about, because I can't remember which Welsh council it was, but it was that idea of they buy into the idea slightly. I saw one of the proposals was that there should be a UBI trial in that borough, and they were trying to decide what group it would be. Would it be redundant steel workers, or would it be the unemployed? And there is a danger, I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on this, that we get something called UBI that isn't UBI. But it's a bit like the climate emergencies for some councils. They get to tick the boxes and say they support this. Do people feel there's a role for campaigners to be pushing more scrutiny on these declarations or these motions?
I think it's something that we're very alert to. If you pick a particular cohort of people and trial it with just them, I think Mark Drakeford, for example, mentioned that he was interested in piloting care leavers. Yeah. And I think that if you focus on a particular cohort of people and you don't get, I mean, it could do more damage than good for the policy. It could put us 10 years back, you know. So I think that's why you need to have, you know, a really wide spread of demographics, really, in terms of the pilot, in order to get that solid empirical evidence to show then that this does work across the board. I mean, if one, it might, you know, I'm not saying that it will, but if you look at one particular cohort of people and it doesn't work for them, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to work for the vast majority of people. So I think that there is a real danger if you focus just solely on one group of people. Yeah, I think the key is it has to be wide enough, any trial, and go on long enough as well to establish anything, really, I would say. So given we've got a political party in the room and it's the Senate election coming up, do you think it's going to be a big issue? I mean, to the politicians and the campaigners, do you think it's going to be a big issue or an issue in the Senate elections, and indeed in the London elections and local elections in England? I don't know if Amelia or Molly want to come back from the Green Party?
I think that this Senate election, the universal basic income will be on the agenda. We've seen people thinking differently. We've seen people challenging the status quo. And although there's a lot of work to do, as Jonathan said, at making sure that people understand what a universal basic income is, people can see that a strong system that supports people and addresses inequality is what was needed for the bad times, for the points of risk. And I think that people are just completely refocusing what their priorities are politically. And what we've seen across Wales is political parties looking towards big solutions. I think that people have been thinking bigger, have been thinking bolder. I know that we've been in this pandemic for a very long time now, but the optimism that people had back in March and April compared to how I think we're all feeling right now was about being able to create something different and to not look at the problems, to have big solutions to solve the problems we had before. And I think that this Senedd election will be the opportunity to talk about those big, bold ideas that can radically transform Wales and radically transform the way that we think about our communities and society.
Can I just chip in as well? I think the Bank of England, wasn't it, today, was very optimistic about what's going to happen with the growth rate, like, oh, we're just going to bounce back. And I'm myself not convinced about that. I think we do have quite a few people who have savings, but a lot of other people have lost their jobs and jobs have disappeared, and it will be difficult to bring them back. So I think there's a reason right there why we need to continue to support people, and also why we need to get money out there to people who will actually spend it, and spend it in ways that helps our economy. So I think that is going to be an argument in the next period, once we are, you know, pray God, able to emerge from our homes again. And the other point is a point Jonathan made near the beginning, which is about how work's changing. And, you know, back in the, I think it was 1974, wasn't it? Andre Gortz wrote The End of Work or something like that. And I wrote a book called Why Work, or no, 7 Myths About Work. That was it. That was the first book I ever wrote. And the question I was asking then is, well, you know, if machines can do all this work, why do we have to go to work? And I answered that question by saying otherwise there wouldn't be any justification for the gross levels of inequality that we have. But anyway, it took me a few pages to argue that. But the point is, now we're back in that same argument again, because we are seeing massive amounts of automation. And this time around, you know, last time around it was sort of blue collar workers, but this time around it's editors. And my son, who's a radiographer, you know, tells me a computer can interpret a CT scan much better than him. So it's sort of white collar, high skilled people that won't be needed in the workforce anymore. So I think that's going to create just a need for people to be supported in their livelihoods without having to go to work, and that will give us that freedom to, you know, put on our togas and play our harps and all that stuff the Greeks wanted to do, and just basically have a great life and create culture and build communities and all those crafty things that people learned in lockdown. And that's how I think we have to frame basic income right now. On the economic side, the need to ensure that we don't fall into a recession, but on the sort of freedom side, the fact that actually we're not needed as workers now. What is the point of forcing people into unpleasant jobs when, you know, we've got computers? And the point is, at the moment, the value of what computers do is all pocketed by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. But what, you know, we have to claim that back. And this is, Amelia's very keen on this windfall tax idea. But, you know, all those people that actually made a vast packet out of COVID, that's a very good source of money to fund the rest of us. So if we can enclose and share the value of automation and feed that out in a universal basic income, then we'll have freedom and bliss and all our crafts and music and everything we wanted from our lives, and we will cease to be wage slaves.
I noticed you slipped in another Greek reference there as well.
Yeah, I'm never going to live.
I'm imagining Jonathan in his toga, that's why.
I think, yeah, it's just fundamentally about an equitable redistribution of time and money. It's, you know, living the lives that we could live. There's we're running out of time. There's 2 brief questions. Someone's asked about stigma, sort of associating with benefits. There's a bit of a conversation going on about that. And someone else has asked, would it have an effect on inflation, universal basic income?
So if I can jump in, I'll take the inflation if I can. I think that the same argument was made when we had quantitative easing during the recession, and we didn't have inflation then. And also the universal basic income, I mean, if we're looking at taxing wealth and then redistributing that, it's the same pot of money, isn't it? It's not like you're pumping this, you know, new money into the system. It's circular. It's just that you're redistributing the money. So it's the same money, so there's not going to be more of it, which would then create inflation. So I think you have to be alert to the fact that potentially it might happen, but I think, you know, my feeling is that if you're just redistributing the same money, then it's not going to happen. So I think that's, and I hate to use this because, you know, it's almost a Brexity a soundbite, but it's a bit of project fear, that one, I think.
I agree with what Jonathan said, but I would just say as well, in terms of inflation, in the lives of most of us, inflation is almost at zero, and that's because the economy is not motoring. You know, oh, motoring's not a good thing for Greens, is it? The economy is sort of on the floor, therefore inflation's very low. But where the inflation's happening, and this did happen with QE, is in inflation in asset values and in the speculative financial circuits. And that's why the question, and in house prices as well, so in all sorts of asset values. So that's why the question that's about modern monetary theory, although I don't think of it as modern monetary theory because it is the Green Party's monetary policy or very close to it, that we have public money creation rather than private money creation and speculative monetary activity, and end the financialization of the economy and focus on the real economy, and then create a money system to support it. That, I think, would remove a lot of that fear of inflation and would allow us to manage the economy so we had enough money to meet the economic needs and the level of economic activity, and that would remove the risk of inflation.
Thanks, Molly. I think we're coming up to the end of the hour.
Oh, nobody said anything about stigma, and I should have said that when I was talking before, because that's the Skivers versus Strivers point. And yes, I mean, there's a deliberate attempt to use stigma to dissuade people from claiming welfare, so they're forced into crap jobs. And that is one of the main benefits of UBI, that everybody would be claiming it, so there would be no stigma attached. And yeah, Julia Hartley-Brewer would no doubt in a very public way refuse to claim hers, but that's fine. Nobody's fussed about that.
I think that's coming to the end of the hour. We could probably talk for another hour. It's been really, really inspiring, really interesting conversation. And thanks so much to all 4 speakers. I'm just sorry we couldn't have more. There's just too many people in the room for that to have an open, flowing conversation. But thanks to everyone who's come along, all the comments. It's all very useful. This is a conversation that's going to carry on, and the campaign's going to carry on. And as we said, it's going to be a big part of the Senate elections. So do keep your eye on, do follow the UBI Labs, get engaged with them, and follow the Green Party people as well. I think all the links have been put up in there, so we're all quite easy to find, and we're all open to further discussions.